let's go on to 11B and talk a little bit about the food tax rebate program. We all doing okay? We're coming up on an hour and 20 minutes. All right? Okay. What? What?
Mayor Bagley, members of the council, I'm Jim Golden, Chief Financial Officer, and this item is on the food tax rebate program that the council asked us a couple of weeks ago to bring back some information on. And got it here. So I wanted to open up with some information first on the impact of the food tax exemption that's been proposed. Last month, we put together some information as a preliminary estimate of the impact of it. It was about $7.2 million. What that was based on at that time, first you need to understand that the city doesn't have that information typically in its records because our grocery vendors are not taking that exemption. They're reporting their total sales to us. So they're not telling us how much of those sales are for food for home consumption. So what we did is we contacted each of those vendors and asked them to give us an estimate of how much that was. And we did receive feedback. There's about, let's say, 14 or so food outlets. Some of them are more than, like, say, King Supers has 3 of those 14. So we were hearing back from 9 or 10 different businesses. And we had heard back from about half or less of those when we gave the first estimate of $7.2 million. So we took what we heard back from those 4 or so vendors, and we applied that percentage across all of our grocery sales records from the previous year, from 2017. Applied the new tax rate and a projection for 18, and that's how we got to $7.2 million. We continued to try to contact the remaining vendors to find out what that was, and you have to understand this is voluntary compliance. They're not required to give us that information. We were asking them for it, and so we weren't getting it all too quickly. We did finally receive from most of the rest of them last week, but also last week what we also received is we decided to contact the state. We have an agreement with the state that we can share sales tax information with each other as long as it's kept confidential. And so we asked the state about it because we wanted to see if they could just tell us what they were reporting for the exemption that they were taking on the state form. And so we did receive that information from the state last week, and we then turned and compared that to what we were receiving from all of the individual businesses. There was a lot of alignment amongst that for most of the businesses. One of the big differences for us was that we have to understand we have Target and we have Walmart and Sam's that are not just grocery stores. They're discount stores as well. And so we've traditionally taken their data and separated it for our reporting purposes between groceries and general, 2 different categories in our sales tax report. And we've done that based on what they have given us an annual estimate of what that would be. So what we found out last week is when we compared that information to what the state's information was, is what they were really giving us was what was the exemption for. They considered the groceries to be the amount that they are also taking as an exemption at the state level for food for home consumption. So basically, 100% of the revenue that we were recording as grocery sales from those businesses is really going to be exempted because it's food for home consumption. Doesn't mean that they don't also sell other types of food, prepared food, but we actually have those falling into the general category based on what they were giving us in the past. So that really revised what we were estimating for those 4 outlets. And so that was a significant change. Between that and some differences that we also had to reconcile with one of the other large groceries, we then came up with a new number, And since we're really talking about a proposal that will take effect in 2019, we converted these to our projections for 2019 revenues. And so that takes this totally up to $9.41 million, which is what I have up there for you, which would actually have been, without the growth for 2019, it would have been about $9 million in 2018. So the breakdown now of the amount of the impact is on the general fund would be $4.53 million. The public improvement fund is about $800,000. Open space fund about $533,000. Streets fund is $2 million, and the public safety fund is $1.55 million impact. So I just wanted to update that for you since it's somewhat related to this topic. And now we'll move a little bit. So what we did is we gathered information from two entities that we were aware of that already have tax rebate programs, either for Arvada's is called a resident tax rebate program, but it's geared in terms of the food as well as Boulder's food tax rebate program. Statistics from Arvada, their population is 115,000. Their tax rate is 3.46. They do about 1,150 rebates annually. Annual rebate total is 120,000. The average rebate is $105. $85 rebate for an individual and $50 for each additional individual in a family or applicant. In Boulder, it's 108,000 population, a little bit higher tax rate. They've processed 920 rebates annually, rebated $100,000 last year, and average rebates $108. They have a little bit different. They rebate $83 for individuals or $253 for families. And they both have a 4-month period of time in which they administer these programs and take applications for rebates from the previous year's, essentially, theoretically, previous year's tax spending. So the eligibility options, again, this kind of combination, what we found out there, for certainly senior citizens are eligible. They'd use different minimum ages, 62 or 65. Disabled individuals are eligible. One of them had single that are aged from 55 to 65 if they're living alone. And then another, a single head of household if they had dependent children. Whereas the other entity, Boulder, I believe it was, would do it for a family with children under 18 in the household. So both of them use the HUD annual income limits, which are based on 50% of median family income, which, by the way, is not the same. What I did put in the communication is actually the 2017 annual income limits. I labeled it 2018, but it was from 2017, and the program that they're rebating in 2018 is what that represents. This here is the 2018 HUD annual income limits for Boulder County. So there's different annual income limits for Arvada than it is for Boulder because they're in different areas. But this is the amount of and this is different from what is showing in your council communication, because this is the 2018 annual income limits, which if you were to put a program into place with using these for 2019 rebates, this is what we'd follow if we were to adopt the HUD annual income limits. So a couple of things about that is that it makes it easy for administration because these are updated automatically annually by HUD. It gives us, it's consistent with what we do with the city housing assistance programs. We use the same income eligibility. So we already qualify individuals who participate in the housing assistance programs, and so we might have an opportunity to take advantage of that and combine that process somehow to avoid some redundancy in qualification. So rebate amounts, just in general, you could decide if you were to do this, what type of or amount of rebate you would give. based on our current sales tax rate of 3.53%. Just gave some examples here of how much that is equal to in the amount of annual purchases. $85 of a rebate backs into $2,408 of purchases, and all the way to $250 here, which backs into a little over $7,000 of purchases. So if you were to do a similar size program with similar criteria and limits as Boulder, I would guess that our estimated rebates might be about $100,000. And of course, if you were to do with larger income levels or different broader qualifications, it would certainly be a larger amount of rebate, I would assume. We would expect that there will be some administrative expenses. We have a number of rebate programs currently. We try to administer them with volunteers at the senior center, and it's beginning to become a little bit too much for them to handle. We're starting to revisit how we're doing those. So I wouldn't want to say that we could do this just with volunteers and get away with it. I know that my staff wouldn't want me to just assign them another program and tell them that we can do it without new resources. So this is just an estimate of needing some potentially temp staff during 4 months of the year if we would administer it like the other two entities do. What we could do, if you're interested in this, we could certainly put together an ordinance possibly within the next 2 months. We also would need to include the cost of the program within the 2019 proposed budget, and then we could implement it in 2019 as well. So looking for council direction, first off, whether you want to implement a food tax program, rebate program, and if so, what eligibility criteria and what potentially how much of a rebate would you be interested in. Haven't really had any other time to pursue any of the other ideas that I heard came up last week. It would certainly be, I'm not ruling anything out of the possibility, but certainly it's easier to do what's in place in those other cities. But if we wanted to create something new, we could certainly look into it. It might take a little longer for us to pull that off, but we could still get it in place for 19, I would think.
I guess just trying to move things along, might get shut down, but I move that we direct staff to prepare an ordinance implementing a food tax rebate program for Longmont, utilizing the HUD annual income limits as mentioned in their presentation. Specifically, it was the 50% of the median family income at some point within the next 2 to 3 months or as their schedule would permit. All right, Councilmember Peck.
Thank you, Mayor Bagley. Jim, could you go back to the slide that says this one? You said that the amount of money is equal to the amount of purchases. Are these purchases food only, or is it annual purchases from grocery stores?
Well, this theoretically, I was just trying to say that an $85 backs into a taxable purchase of $2,408. So you would theoretically be saying that if you're trying to give an exemption in lieu of give a rebate in lieu of an exemption for food for home consumption, then you're assuming it's $2,408 of purchases of food for home consumption. But it's just a for instance. It's just trying to give you a sense. Okay, and kind of the 4-month thing. Are you saying that if you keep your receipts for 2018, it will take, in 2019, those rebates will take 4 months to mail back? Or I didn't understand that. No, actually, I'm sorry. I should have probably been specific about that. So neither one of these programs require anyone to bring receipts. They just need to qualify, meet the criteria for qualification that I went through there. And then if they qualify, they would automatically get, based on size of the family and however you set those rebates, they would automatically get that level of a rebate. So no one needs to submit receipts or keep receipts.
What was the 4 months?
It's just they leave their program open for 4 months so that someone can put in an application for 4 months and then gets reviewed. Do they meet the criteria? They'll rebate the tax. So if they don't apply for it within that 4-month window, then
They won't
program's
get it.
done for that year.
Okay. I think a rebate program is okay, but I think there might be better ways to do this. So I don't want to vote for this tonight. And that's, I would rather have discussion on different methods of helping people with the tax on food. So I'm going to vote against it only because I would like discussion on other methods. So.
All right, Councilmember Martin?
With the eligibility criteria that you are using, would this cover the same set of people who are eligible for SNAP, or is it a superset of people who are eligible for SNAP?
Mayor Bagley, members of council, so I would think this is going to be a larger level than the amount that are eligible for SNAP. So, I talked to Kathy Fedler about these HUD income limits, and I think you've seen some data previously, and she did just give me a handout tonight that you've seen before, but it does cover, give you an idea of how many households in Longmont are fall underneath these income guidelines, and so we have 3,763 households at 30% of median income, and 2,558 households at 50% of median income. So I think that's probably a larger amount than what's eligible for SNAP.
Okay, and then when you were assuming the cost to the city, were you assuming that everyone who was eligible would apply, and if not, what application rate did you assume?
Mayor Bagley, members of council, I really just looked at what the rebate rate was, and which would be also the rate of application in those other entities with larger populations than us. So it really, as I said before, it's really going to depend on if we have different level of criteria, different level of rebates, and of course we could have a different level of participation here. So it's really hard to estimate the amount of the rebate. It might be sensible to budget a little bit greater in the first year in case we have a much larger turnout in Longmont.
Right, since we're better maybe at outreach to our populations than some other cities, we might get a much larger turnout, which would not necessarily be a bad thing because we like our population, right? Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
Councilmember Rodriguez?
Thank you, Mayor Bagley. I think I'm going to kind of fall with Councilmember Peck on this one, that I feel it's a little premature to necessarily move towards an ordinance immediately tonight. I was the one that motioned to have this information brought forth, and I think it was really to get some concrete numbers compared to all the numbers that have been thrown at us over the last month or so. And so I'm going to probably decline to vote on that. I'll vote on the motion. I'll probably vote against the motion. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Waters?
Thank you, Mayor Bagley. So a couple questions. Jim, explain to me, I was tracking what you were presenting until you answered the question about receipts. So somebody qualifies based on income using the HUD criteria. How do we know how much they've spent on food, or do we care how much they've spent on food? At a certain income level, you automatically qualify for a rebate of X. Is that the way it works?
That is correct, Mayor Bagley, members of council. So we don't care how much they've spent on food.
Okay, so unrelated to that, but related to the first set of numbers, the $9.42 million. And I realize that's an estimate. I asked the city manager, last week or so, what percentage of our budget is personnel, and I think you said to me, Harold, 78%? 73.5. So I'm just sitting here kind of rolling in my head. if we anticipate, if the removal of sales tax for every member of this community, for food, removal of tax on food for every member of the community, is going to result in a 9.4, what is it, $1 or $4.2 million reduction in revenues. I start to think about having been through these kinds of processes in other times of my life, like, well, okay, if you were just to apply that across the board, you know, what's 73% of 9.41 or $2 million in terms of personnel, right? And then I start to do those numbers and think of how many more people we're going to create as eligible for this program, right? Because they would be losing their jobs if you approached it that way. I'm not suggesting you would. I'm just trying to, you know. Or then I start to think about if you didn't reduce any personnel and you reduced 9.41 or $2 million of programs and services, who's going to be most affected? And then I think that conversation we had last Tuesday night about homelessness, about costs and timeframes for development, about what we do or don't, all the great things we do through a community services office and what we wouldn't do and who's going to be affected. And I keep coming back to the very people we're trying to help at the end of the day are going to be most directly impacted by the loss of those revenues. So I think an ordinance directing staff to bring back an idea we need to move forward with. So I'm going to support that motion because we're not settling on a plan tonight. We've got many degrees of freedom, I think, to give direction on the specifics of it. But I'm just sitting here reflecting on the implications if we don't come up with a viable alternative and given at least our community some options, assuming the Untaxed Food initiative might qualify. I don't know if it does for the budget. But I just think we need to be really clear as we do this what the implications are if we don't, or if an ordinance, or not an ordinance, an initiative passes and we are now going to be around this table deciding who's going to pay a price in terms of their employment or the services they receive from the city. So I'd like to see something. I'd like to move it forward, so I'm going to support the motion just to keep it moving forward.
Can I clarify a couple of things?
Only if you're not going to make me sound stupid.
Oh, please
go ahead.
talk. Go ahead, Harold.
Well, I just want to make sure. So when we talk about, and Jim, you can, if I'm wrong, tell me. The 9.4 million is in aggregate. So the 4.5 million with the general fund is really where that conversation comes into play. But when you look at things,
Well, let me take you through all the funds.
yeah, that's what I was about to do.
All right, because it's in the general fund, it's about 73.5%
Right.
is for salary and benefits. In the public safety fund, it's probably a much higher percentage. I don't know that one off the top of my head, but I would think it's closer to 85 to 90% there. Public improvement fund, and the open space fund, neither one of those really is much or any for hardly any in the open space fund, but none in the public improvement fund for salary and benefits. And the street funds is probably about 50%, I'm guessing. So impact is lower, but still the point is clear.
Well, and to get specific, so as we've talked about, I mean, and we're talking budget issues anyway in general right now on other things that we're going to talk to you about next week. But so when you look at potentially an impact of the public safety fund, if council will remember, we just increased the public safety fund, and we had a number of officers and other things that were outlined in this. What we would do in that case is we would come in and say, what we were planning for in the future, we couldn't do because of this. And so while it may not mean somebody today that's there or an operation, it means things that we pushed out when we ran that forward we couldn't do. So that would be that would be something you would see there on the street funds, 50% personnel, but you have a lot of projects. We would be talking about projects in terms of what's in the street fund and what we couldn't do. So it would be a mix of all of the above.
All right, we've got a motion. Let's go ahead and vote. But, you know, before, don't, wait. Just rule, point of order, if this fails, it's done till the next executive legislative session. So vote wisely. Meaning in 18 months, meaning unless somebody moves to bring it back on the winning side. Threw you off, Valerie, sorry. All right. All right, that passes with council members Finley, Bagley, Martin, Christensen, and Waters voting for, and council members Rodriguez and Peck voting against. All right, thank you very much.
Mayor, Council, I do want to follow up. I did also hear other potential implementation ideas. Is there anything specifically, as we're looking at this, that you would like us to examine?
I think it's just bring us back something and let's talk. That was my understanding. Mayor Pro Tem?
I would like us to examine an idea that Councilman Waters had about a pass, such as an eco pass, that someone could just present at the grocery store. I think that would facilitate it being less expensive to administer, and also would facilitate people who could benefit from it actually using it. Thanks.
Councilmember Peck?
Thank you, Mayor Bagley. My problem with the rebate program is that if we're actually going to help people with their food tax, we should look at a different option, because not many people actually apply for the rebates. They're too onerous. So I did like the idea of the of some kind of a card that could be handed out to people either through the Hour Center or through Karen Roney's programs, based upon the same HUD AMIs. I would just like to look at that before, and that was why I voted against it, the ordinance, because I just think if we're actually going to work to help people with their food tax, then we should reach as many people as we can without totally destroying our budget. So I agree. I would like to look at that program. Does this make sense to you, Jim, what we're talking about?
Sure. Mayor Bagley, members of council, it makes sense. I think, as I said before, I think it's going to be a little bit harder for us to put that together. I also think it's going to cost you more than $100,000 in rebates, so we will need to budget more for that, because you're talking about basically, instead of having people having to apply, that every purchase they make will be exempt. So I think the impact, we'll have to try to come up with an estimate of that, but that'll be hard to do. So.
Dr. Waters?
Thank you, Mayor Bagley. Yeah, I used that example the last time we met of the equivalent of a King Soopers card. I wasn't, somebody interpreted that as promoting King Soopers or something. I wasn't necessarily doing that. But the technology exists to be able to do this, so it's an exemption as opposed to a rebate. So I'd like to, if given what I don't know about the legalities, whether or not legally we can approach this in a way that if it increases the number of participants who are food insecure, then I'd like to increase the number of people who are food insecure. That's the intent. And that's, if I've said from day one, I think everybody here has said the same thing, that we would like to unburden and then deal with the consequences, unburden those who are food insecure, if we can do it, without doing damage to that same population based on the kind of cuts we'd have to make. So somewhere between $100,000 and $9.4 million is going to be a number or an estimate. So I voted for this motion because we can get some options on the table and have more specific discussions about what the options are, what the legalities are, and get some reaction from the community. I'd love to hear. We've heard from advocates, and I appreciate their effort and their intent from the Unfood Tax Group. I'd love to hear from others in the community who have a stake in this as well, and what they're thinking. Everybody would like to be unburdened of all their taxes, but that's not without consequence, and that we ought to have a chance to talk about what those consequences are in a thoughtful way together before we get too much further into this.
And I guess what comes to my mind is, my personal opinion, one of 7, is that the easier this is, the better. And if someone is at a 50% of AMI, that's what, 25%? Is everyone in Longmont, 25% of the homes and families in Longmont are eligible, more or less? I personally think it'd be a lot easier. They spend, maybe it's not 2,302 or whatever the number is, but it's going to be between 2,100 and 2,500. And then whether they get $79 or $87, it just, I guess I would propose not going through a lot of headache, creating extra bureaucracy. I think if we want to help people, we publicize it and we push it after it's available. The other thing is that the more work we do on this, again, I go back to, I really bought into the whole idea of at our retreat, focusing, and not just us, giving staff time to focus on the things that we decided were important. And if staff is going to be working over the next 2 months, developing different options for something that will impact, 900 families for a total of $100,000, that is 2 months and hours and staff time when they are not working on affordable housing, inclusionary zoning, transportation, the amendments to our land use code. This is a huge squirrel that was brought about by members of our public that came to a public invited to be heard and said, we're doing this, and next thing you know, we're chasing a squirrel. That's what I think. So I would want us to do it just as simply as possible, and then if it's whether they're going to get a $79 rebate or an $87 or a $79 tax avoidance, I can't think of the word right now, or a $80 rebate. In Spanish, me da lo mismo. It's all the same, and so that's what I'd push for, simplicity.
I think we've gotten an idea.
All right. Are there any other comments, questions, or concerns that haven't been addressed yet? Councilmember Martin?
Thank you, Mayor Bagley. I would just like to point out that there's maybe a disconnect here, which is if our problem is avoiding the application process, I don't know how people are going to get their little magic cards without an application process. So let's get that clear. And then the other thing that I think should be clear is that even if a card was involved somehow, it would still have to be administered as a rebate.
And also, there might be implications as to whether or not that rebate comes before or after bond obligations we have, et cetera. So anyway, Mayor Pro Tem. Okay.